In this demonstration, we want to look at the feature in Photoshop called feathering. And before we get on to what feathering does do, let's look at a situation where we don't use feathering and see the effect of it. So in this image that I have here in front of me, I've selected my owl object in the middle of the image, and I'm about to do a layer via copy or a layer via cut. So I'm going to right click and go layer via cut. And that cuts the owl out onto a new layer. And we can see here what's happening over the layers window. I've got my owl on the top layer, and I've been left behind the rest of the background on the bottom layer. Now, if I add in a new layer above the background layer and below the new layer that has my owl object on it, I'll just get a completely transparent layer, and I'm going to fill that with some color. Once we get a new background in there behind my object, I can see the edges of my selection and how it was selected, and when I went layer via cut, how it was cut out from the background layer onto a new layer. We can see at the edges they're very, very sharp, they're very, very rough edges. It's almost like somebody came along with the scissors and cut that owl object out of a magazine or a newspaper. I would like to soften those edges slightly. And the time to do that is at the selection time. So I'm going to step backwards a few steps until I get right back to where my selection was and before I cut my selection onto a new layer. At this stage, anytime that I create a selection like this, as long as I'm on a selection tool, I can right click over the selection, and one of the options on that shortcut menu is called feather. Now what feathering does, it opens up this little dialog box and asks me for a feather radius. This softens the edge of my selection, and generally a feather radius between 0 and 5 is generally not noticeable once I cut it and put a new background in behind it. Anything more than 5, it starts to become noticeable. So I'm going to leave it at this feather radius that's been suggested to me here, 3. I'll click OK. When we see it, we'll probably see very little difference in the image. We might see a slight smoothing out of that marching black ant line, but other than that, it doesn't look as if anything has happened. The main difference happens in if I go through the same procedure as I did before, where I right click and go layer via cut, and then add in a new layer in the background and fill it with color. Again, I see a slight softening of that edge there. The edge is a little bit softer, and it just dithers the colors enough either side of the selection line so that it just smoothens out the edge a little bit. Obviously, the more of a feathering that I do, the more pronounced it will be. So for instance, if I come back here and I put a feathering of something that's much, much more than 3, if I go for 15 for instance, click OK, and then I'll go back and do my usual layer via cut and stick in a new layer, and I fill it with color. Then I can see an even softer edge there. And let's step backwards just one more time and I'll do it even more so. So this time I'll go and put in a feathering of, we'll go mad, we'll go put in 50 pixels there. Click OK, and then I go layer via cut and a new layer and fill that new layer with color. And so I can see now it starts to really fade and blur. So that's when it becomes noticeable. The feather radius is generally reliant on the overall resolution of the image that you're working in to kind of how much an effect or blurring of the edges or this kind of vignette effect it will do. But generally, any type of selections that I make, if I'm going to slide other things in behind it, generally I would feather the edges a little bit. And that's feathering in Photoshop.